his eyes and reported on the second article, the definition. Abandoned lands are those on which no one has lived for the past 100 years and where no crops have been grown. Article 3, property rights. Lands that meet all the requirements stated above pass into the possession of the one who cultivates them. The young man raised his finger and said that, firstly, their money and labor were invested in these lands. Secondly, housing for people can be built on these lands. Thirdly, the development of long-term agriculture is possible. The man gritted his teeth in displeasure and sweated. The hero stepped forward and shoved his hands into his pockets to name the fourth point. He grabbed a bunch of grass and pulled an onion out of the ground. The boy said that all this was backed up by a special rule when the first harvest had already been reaped from these lands. Rakona looked at him in rage. The knight stared at the gentleman in amazement, remembering how he had said that the seeds would help repel pests. The youth smiled and congratulated the Viscount on witnessing the first harvest in the Merez swamps. He added that there was no charge for viewing. They were not that greedy. The interlocutor grimaced and ground his teeth, not understanding how this idiot knew all this, and whether he had prepared in advance. The boy thrust the onion at the man and generously allowed him to take it as a gift. Lloyd looked menacingly at the nobleman and demanded that he leave their territory. Rakona was shaking with anger, but he said nothing. The ill-wishers turned and rode away while the young man stood and watched them go. Xavier approached him and asked how the gentleman knew that these people would come here. The hero narrowed his eyes and muttered that he had seen such smart guys before who tried to rise on the labor of others. They turned around, hearing a cry of jubilation. The workers joyfully raised their pitchforks and rakes, shouting that the young master had protected their lands. The boy grimaced in irritation and asked where they thought he should get the money for their wages. Lloyd ordered them to quickly get back to work. It was pouring rain, and streams of water flowed down the ditches. The hero sat, not paying attention to the fact that he was wet. Summer was over, and autumn had come, and with it the rains. The mill turned the water. He had used the modeling 100 times, but it was too early for him to relax. An umbrella opened above the young man. The boy thought that he should be completely sure that the lands of Merez were truly fertile. The knight held an umbrella over him. Finally, the sun came out. There was no water left in the dug holes. The hero and his swordsman looked at the fields that were not damaged by the downpour. Notification: knowledge in the field of monumental construction has been acquired. You have left a significant mark on the civil engineering of the continent of Laurasia. As a reward, you have received great experience. Measurement, intermediate level 3, land valuation, underground scanning. Design, intermediate level 3, blueprint visualization, terrain layout, simulation mode. The hero rose from the ground. Baron's sympathy level +5. Baroness's sympathy level +5. Xavier's sympathy level +3. Baron's sympathy level +2. People's sympathy level +3. RP 1355. Lloyd smiled and said that they could proceed to the next step. At this time, in the lands of Viscount Rakona, the man slammed the table and asked again about land reclamation. The subject standing opposite him cringed and said that they would be exempt from paying taxes for 3 years. In exchange, they would be required to live in those lands, so they would not be able to leave. The nobleman frowned and muttered that it meant that the inhabitants of those lands would be actively cultivating them for the next 2 years, since he was the owner and the land was his. He thought with regret that the Merez swamps promised mountains of gold. Rakona clutched his stomach, which was twisted with worry, and remembered that this was part of his land. The man decided that he would not give it up so easily. He looked at the manager and, frowning, ordered a council to be convened. A couple of days later, the protagonist sat up in bed, clutching his head. The boy opened his eyes and wondered why his head was splitting. Maybe it was just fatigue. Lloyd sat up and thought that it was not the time to lie around here because they were organizing and distributing. The knight sleeping in the chair shuddered when his master called him to work. The boy looked warily at the swordsman and asked why he was so confused. It seemed that knights could get tired too. The blonde rubbed his forehead. He frowned and muttered that he had never felt like this before. His head hurt like it was going to split. The brown-haired man put his hand to his temple and frowned. The boy grimaced, realizing something. Testimony of the Baron's maid Emily. The girl touched her temple and muttered that she had a very bad headache since this morning. Testimony of a farmer from the village of Olaf. The man closed his eyes and said that he and all his household members, and even the children, were suffering from headaches. Testimony of a boy named Mihail, who looks after the cows on the farm. The young man looked at the animals with concern and said that the cows had not been drinking since yesterday, and that dehydration was not far away. The hero and the knight were walking down the street. The boy thoughtfully touched his chin and muttered that the villagers were complaining, and even the animals were avoiding drinking. The boy frowned and thought that the reason was in the water, as he had assumed. One of the most powerful weapons the boy could use in this world was information. However, after the incident with the giant ants, he realized that events could be happening now that were not in the novel. The brown-haired man expected that Viscount Rakona could lay claim to these lands, so he decided to make some inquiries about him. The main source of income for the Rakona estate is a secret technology for dyeing things, and the same technology is used to dye fruit. The boy grimaced in irritation and muttered the name of the enemy, Frontera estate. Arcus looked at his interlocutor in shock and asked again. A subject Viscount was sitting opposite him and said that the man understood everything perfectly well. He frowned and demanded that they give them part of the drained Murez swamps, and then they would stop polluting the water. The Baron frowned and exclaimed, "How dare he threaten him now?" The interlocutor grinned and confirmed that it was a threat. The man slammed his hands on the table and said that he would file an official complaint with the royal court. Rakona's servant looked at the Baron indifferently and said that perhaps he would even win the case. He leaned forward and, grinning, added that it would take more than 1 year for them to make a decision. Legal expenses, as well as the purchase of drinking water, are not small. The interlocutor asked whether Frontera would be able to hold out for that long. The Baron gritted his teeth but said nothing. The guest stood up and advised the man to make a wise decision. He glanced sideways at the owner as he passed. Arcus turned around and said that his son and their workers had shed blood and sweat draining these swamps. He promised that he would not give up a piece of land to such a scoundrel. The man bowed with a grin before leaving. At that moment, the door abruptly opened, knocking the guest, and the protagonist entered with the knight. The young man smiled and said that he had an urgent conversation with the Baron. Lloyd bowed and said that the parasitic neighbors had decided to spoil their water and he would like to discuss measures to counter them. Rakona's servant put his hand to his cheek and exclaimed in displeasure that the guy had just insulted his master. The brown-haired man flinched and said that he had scared him. The hero made a face of horror and asked if the parasitic offspring really understood human speech. The face of the interlocutor was distorted with anger. He held out his sword and shouted that Kernot himself was challenging Lloyd to a duel for insulting a noble knight. A little later, the hero was using educational measures by beating him with a shovel during the duel. The swordsman curled up into a ball and shouted that he was giving in and accepting defeat. The man, in tears, held out his hand and asked him to stop. Lloyd sighed and agreed that he had had enough too. The boy abruptly resumed the beating, declaring that the Baron deserved another lesson for his rudeness. Arcus, smiling happily, said, "Oh, this bully son." The duel was over and he still continues. Xavier glanced sideways at his master and thought that he had never seen such a happy face on his master's face before. Evening of the same day, the enemy estate. The wounded Kernot stood before his lord with his head down. The Viscount looked angrily at the servant and shouted that he had sent him to resolve the issue, not to return like a beaten dog. The man muttered that he was very ashamed. The nobleman thoughtfully twirled his mustache and said that it was even good that the servant returned so beaten. Kernot looked at the gentleman in surprise. The Viscount leaned on his hands and decided that the only chance to deal with the Baron was to file a lawsuit for assault on a nobleman. He bared his teeth and said that 3, even 4 years would be needed for the proceedings. The protagonist stretched his lips into a sinister smile and said that this was exactly what the enemy thought. The young man frowned and resolutely exclaimed that Frontera would not let their efforts go to waste. He raised his shovel, looking at the assembled soldiers and orcs, and shouted that no mercy would be shown to anyone who stood in their way. The guy said that these lands were soaked in their blood and sweat. Lloyd frowned and said that they would protect their territories from their greedy hands. The army loudly supported the gentleman's speech. To begin with, the hero decided to deal with the problem of drinking water and build a reservoir. Using the hippo skill, they would pump water from where it had not yet been spoiled. Hippo skill, powerful blow, level 3. The animal was pouring out water. The knight looked at the master and said that this was a good alternative, but the hero and his creature would have to forget about rest. The young man agreed, but added that this was a temporary measure. He turned to the swordsman and suggested that they take care of the water supply system. They would build a waterway from the Capua River from the eastern mountains to their estate. Xavier looked at the brown-haired man and noted that it would not be easy. It was worth considering how much effort it would require. Lloyd smiled and replied that they would have to cut back on expenses, and a lot. He turned around and said that they would earn a lot on this construction. The guy threw the shovel over his shoulder and said that it would be 100 times more. A couple of months later, Rakona bit his nails in horror. He asked, trembling, how this was possible and did not know what to do. The manager entered the office and reported that Frontera's eldest son was requesting an audience. The man frowned and ordered that he be told to get out of here. The subordinate reported that the hero said that something had been bothering the Viscount lately, and he was here to resolve the matter. The man froze in surprise. Lloyd lounged on the sofa and noticed that Rakona was not feeling well at all. The knight stood behind him. The Viscount sat down opposite him and asked what the young man needed. The guy reminded him that he had come to solve his problem. The man frowned and asked what he was talking about. The brown-haired man grinned and suggested that he be honest. He leaned forward and asked with a smile what the other man would do if the young man saved his dying business from ruin. Rakona turned pale. The man frowned and was indignant that this was the work of the guy who would destroy his workshop. The hero grinned. Lloyd closed his eyes and said that they had done a great job. Thanks to the fact that the Viscount had spoiled all the water, they had to get it from the Capua River. The other man gritted his teeth, listening to him. The brown-haired man grinned and said that at first he had no idea that this was his work. As he managed to find out from the supposedly friendly note, the water was used for its intended purpose. In general, they had to dig the earth from the river to the estate itself, process it, fill it up. They had come a long way. Rakona slammed his fist on the table and asked how this was connected with his workshop. The young man asked him to just listen further and be patient. The hero said that then a huge valley stood in their way. Lloyd waved his hand and noted that they had no other choice but to build a Roman aqueduct, a water conduit for delivering water to settlements, irrigation and hydroelectric systems from sources located above them. In order to find the limestone they needed, they had to carry out blasting operations. As a result, completely unintentionally, limestone began to settle on the bottom of the valley, a very large amount. The man nervously clenched his fists and exclaimed what this had to do with his workshop. The guy smiled and said that the water from the valley is used in his production. The limestone particles had ruined the colors of the fabrics. The Viscount slammed the table and said he would sue the royal court. The hero crossed his arms and said it was his right. The young man grinned and said it would take at least 2 years to reach a decision. Would anyone still remember Rakona's product? The man sweated and clenched his teeth, mentally calling his interlocutor a disgusting runt and a piece of trash. Lloyd stood up and said it was time to go, since he had satisfied his curiosity. The Viscount pointed his finger at him and shouted that the hero had messed with the wrong person, since he had many acquaintances in the royal palace. The interlocutor's face distorted with anger, and he said that the guy would repay him tenfold. The brown-haired man just waved his hand and left. The hero and the knight were walking back along the road. Xavier looked at the gentleman and said that he could not understand everything. He noted that by provoking the Viscount, the young man had only angered him even more. It seemed that Rakona would stand his ground to the end. The man had great connections in the capital. If it came to litigation, they would lose even more money. Lloyd put his hands in his pockets and replied that he understood what the swordsman was getting at. He asked to just wait a little longer. The other man looked at him questioningly. The young man smiled and muttered that they would still see who would lose more. The sun was shining over the plain. A month later, Rakona bowed, burying his head in the floor, and declared that he was wrong. He asked to save his production. Lloyd looked at the nobleman with disdain, and Xavier watched this picture in shock. The brown-haired man lifted his chin and asked if smart people had really conveyed to the man the idea that he would not win. The guy thought it was obvious, because it would not work to plot. This would be his ultimate failure. The man replied that he had been reckless and that he was truly sorry. The hero leaned on his hand and said that he was not particularly interested in words. Rakona began to sweat and exclaimed that he, the Viscount, was humiliating himself and begging in this way. The youth grinned and asked if pride was worth at least 0.1 gold. If so, he would sell it for 1,000 or even 10,000 times more. Tears welled up in the man's eyes. Lloyd leaned over and said that he did not need an apology. The boy showed a contract for the supply of water between Baron Frontera and Viscount Rakona and asked for only a small signature. The interlocutor began to look through the document. The hero said that the man should sign here, and his workshop would be restored in a week. The Viscount turned white. He frowned and shouted that it was too expensive, and what was the point of paying for water at all? The young man looked menacingly at the nobleman and reminded him that he was the one who taught the hero that water had to be paid for. Rakona looked at the young man with fear and trembled. The sky turned the colors of the sunset. Arcus leafed through the contract in surprise and asked if such a huge amount would really be coming in every month. Lloyd put his hands on his hips and replied that the Viscount himself had signed the papers. His father muttered that if that was the case, he would be able to pay off the interest and even have some left. The young man clapped his hands and said with a smile that the Viscount turned out to be such a good man. At these words, the knight turned pale. Xavier knew that Rakona himself had started this war, and in the end everything ended in favor of their estate and the Baron. However, now the young master was already starting to look like the devil. After all, this contract did not specify the terms. This means that the guy will suck all the money out of the Viscount until his death, and then he will take money from his heirs generation after generation. The hero smiled ominously and thought that he would not stop so easily. If he could exchange it for money, he would suck all the life out of the man. Arcus raised his head and said that he had good news for his son. Seeing the frozen grin on the hero's face, the Baron said that he was a little worried about his facial expressions. Lloyd apologized and said that he was just happy. The young man massaged his cheeks and looked at his father in surprise when he reminded him that he still had treasures given to him by the Orc tribe. Arcus said that Count Cremo had sent a letter stating that he was ready to buy them for a good price. The boy and the knight looked at the owner of the estate with interest. The hero tilted his head thoughtfully. He touched his chin and noted that it was strange, because for such a sum the count could easily find new treasures. The father replied that he did not know the details, but the buyer mentioned something about a bronze statue. The trading city of Cremo. The man in the cloak stood and looked out the window. The Count of Cremo frowned. The moon was shining above the water's surface. Suddenly, something appeared on the surface of the water. The man jerked and frowned. The water rose and a large monster with claws appeared from it. The Count squinted, looking at the Titan Giga. Xavier reported to the Baron that they would sail in a week. The work to restore the water supply in the territory of Rakona was almost complete. The knight folded his hands behind his back and added that, in order to minimize the cost of moving, only 10 people would go with them. Arcus trimmed a bush and replied that it was good if Lloyd decided so. The man fell silent. The swordsman looked closely at the master and promised to look after his son. The Baron said that when the knight Kernot arrived here and began to threaten and demand half of the Merez lands, then before he would have simply given everything up out of fear. Arcus looked at the plant and added that he had become braver thanks to Lloyd and their efforts. He said that he was initially an indecisive and incapable person. The boy looked at the gentleman in shock and assured him that this was not true. Xavier said that the Baron was the kindest person who was always worried about others. It was he who once sheltered a boy who later became a talented knight. The nobleman smiled and thanked him for the kind words. However, the man said that it was hard to be a good lord with only such a meager supply of qualities. Leaders must have strong faith and character. Arcus turned to the bush and said that this is exactly what his son is now. The knight looked down and thought that the hero's only faith was money, but there was no point in talking about it. Lately, it was difficult for him to remain confident that this was bad. The man stood up and said that from now on, Xavier's job would simply be to look after his son. He grinned and added that the knight must always be with the Baron's heir. The swordsman looked at his master in surprise and, putting his hand to his chest, accepted the order. The blonde thought that even though the young man had revived the estate, he would never like this man. He remembered how in the past the Baron had asked Xavier what he wanted to do in the future to help him realize his dream. The boy blushed and replied that he wanted to become a knight who would protect the Baron. The man laughed and patted him on the head. Arcus smiled and said that the little boy who survived the severe frosts would become the strongest in the world. And so, the Baron gave him a wooden sword that he had carved himself, and this gift was destroyed by Lloyd Frontera. Then the Baron's son laughed at the blonde's dream of becoming a knight and stepped on the sword. Xavier entered the room and took off his coat. He looked to the side, where the Baron's broken gift hung on the wall. The main character smiled and thanked the guy for using the Frontera lullaby service. The young man sat on the bed and smirked that the swordsman had become dependent, and if he did not obey, the service would immediately stop. Xavier asked to start already. Lloyd began to read out another boring instruction, and under his voice the knight began to fall asleep. The blonde thought that he still saw another person in him. The gentleman who made his way into the mine, dug the earth and defended the estate deserved respect. The brown-haired man snapped his fingers with a smile and said, "Red Sun." The knight fell asleep hugging the pillow. He hated himself for considering the young gentleman a worthy person. The moon was shining in the sky. The hero was sleeping in bed and the swordsman in a chair. Suddenly, the silhouette of a man with a sword appeared in the open window. He looked at the sleeping Lloyd with hatred and drew his sword. The offender gritted his teeth and thought that the young man was to blame for everything. The man jumped up and raised his sword to attack. At that moment, Xavier jumped up, his eyes flashing. He made a quick lunge, cutting the enemy's weapon. The killer looked at the broken blade in fear. Lloyd opened his eyes, awakened by a scream. The young man stood up and watched in surprise as the knight knocked the intruder to the floor. The next day, the protagonist stood and watched the construction of pipes. He loudly asked what was the most important thing in any enterprise. The workers answered in unison that safety was above all. A knight approached the brown-haired man and said that he had passed the information on to Viscount Rakona. The aristocrat turned around and praised him. The swordsman looked at the gentleman and asked the reason why the killer attacked him. The hero put his hand on his belt and assumed that it was because the Viscount, who had spent a lot of money on water, fired him first. The guy shrugged and said that he would have done the same. He is paid well, but he does not fulfill his duties. Lloyd said that the man attacked him to vent his anger. He added that all pathetic people are alike. The interlocutor clarified whether the nobleman knew that this would happen. The hero answered that he did not know for sure, but expected that this could happen. Xavier frowned and said that it was an omission, not to prepare for such an outcome in advance. He was surprised that the gentleman did not bother to prepare, although he predicted various situations. The young man looked at the interlocutor and asked him in bewilderment what he was talking about. Lloyd turned around and asked why he needed to prepare if the knight was always nearby. The blonde stared at the brown-haired man in shock. The hero pointed to himself and said that he was walking and talking only because the swordsman was there. This says a lot about his abilities and reliability. The knight winced when the boy asked if he really thought that every 5-year-old boy left